Welcome to the update tutorial on the internet on making coffee. If you are confused, if you are intimidated, don't be. Making coffee doesn't have to be hard. All you need is coffee and water and an understanding of how what you do affects the end result, which, yes, is more complicated than it sounds. We're going to talk through it. People have been drinking coffee for at least 600 years, probably longer. If we couldn't make it taste good before electricity, digital scales, we probably wouldn't still be talking about it today. So the agenda is we're going to talk about what happens while we're brewing, how to identify bad extraction, whether it's over or under extracted, and then we're going to talk about the elements to think about when you're trying to change something in your brew, and then we're going to apply all of that to an example like French press or a drip method, which I think are just pretty common brewing methods. Okay, so to go over what happens when we're brewing coffee, I have visual aids. This is our water. I'm assuming you're intending to brew a particular end volume of coffee, so water is our constant, and it's just like Velcro, it loves to stick to stuff. So in roasting, the coffee is going to expand, it's going to get more porous, and you're going to have all of these compounds that form inside all trapped in the cellulose network. The longer it roasts, the more porous it becomes, the more extractable it becomes, right? The more porous it is, the easier it is for water to flow deeper into the particles of coffee after you grind it and extract more stuff out of it. So it's easier to extract more out of darker roasted coffee than out of lighter roasted coffee because it's denser and the water's just not going to penetrate as deep into the grinds. The coffee seeds have caffeine, right? So this is a coffee cell. No, that would be too ridiculous. But basically, this is a coffee grind. Inside that coffee grind, we have caffeine. We're going to have most of what the flavor is, and that's aromatic compounds. This is going to be our aromatic compounds. We're going to have some acids. We're going to have some lipids. There's actually, because they're seeds, there's quite a lot of lipids or fats inside the coffee, but fats are hydrophobic, so we're not really extracting much of them. Especially if you're using a paper filter, the paper is going to absorb most of the oils, so they become kind of irrelevant. But they are there. The only time it's really an issue is the coffee is like really badly stored and those fats go rancid. Good talk. Okay, we're going to have sugars, and we're going to have what I'm just going to call byproducts of roasting. So these are going to be over caramelized sugars, or just general plant matter that's going to taste unpleasant. So I'm just going to call these byproducts of roasting that we don't want. Or if we do get them, we want the bare minimum so we can't really taste them. Okay. Then I have a coffee filter that had an accident and required some repairs. If you imagine this is the perfect amount of coffee for this volume of water. Okay, and the water is going to come in here. It's going to come in contact with these coffee grinds, and it's going to start extracting things. Sure, right now. Okay, so this is our good extraction. This is our ideal extraction. We've extracted all of the things out of those coffee grinds that are going to taste good, and we've left behind all those byproducts of roasting that are not. This is our good, well-balanced extraction. So if we imagine that we add more coffee to this. So we're adding more coffee to the same amount of water that we're going to extract with. So since we added more coffee, we're adding more of this material. So we're going to have more caffeine, more aromatic compounds, more acids, more fats, more sugars, and more of these roasting byproducts, right? So now we're coming through. We're going to start extracting, coming out the bottom. Stick it to the coffee. Chaotic. So here we've come through, the water has picked up everything it could pick up. This is all we can extract from it. And because we had more material, now we have still a whole lot of these acids and aromatic compounds and flavors left behind, so the water doesn't have a high enough concentration of all of the stuff because we didn't get enough of it out. Right? I hope this is making sense, because it seems like, oh, the water picked up all it can pick up and the stuff that's left behind isn't really necessary. But if you think about how, the aroma is still in here, and since it picks up different things in different proportions through the brewing process as it's extracting the most easily extractable material, the stuff that's left behind is going to make it taste flat and watery, and it might be sour, it might be salty. It's going to be we're going to call this under extracted, okay? We left too much material that tastes good behind. This coffee is under extracted. If we're using fewer grinds, that means we have less material. Everyone's falling out. So we're still going to have some of this stuff. We're going to have caffeine, acids, and aromas. But we're not going to have everything. So now the water is going to come through. It's going to keep trying to pick up whatever is available. So now we've extracted basically everything we had available to extract. And the water picked up all of those, the flavor compounds. There's less coffee, so it picked up all the flavor compounds it could get, all the acids, the fats stayed behind. All the acids, all the sugars it could get its hands on, and it started picking up all of these byproducts of roasting that are going to give it negative flavor. So we've extracted too much, more than we would ideally intend, and this coffee is we're going to call this over extracted. It's going to taste bitter, most likely, or just generally unpleasant. I hope that made things make more sense. Under extraction, when we haven't extracted enough material, that's going to taste watery, that's going to taste weak. It could be bitter, it could be sour, astringent, like it's sucking the moisture out of your mouth. It could even be salty. Over extraction can also be bitter. It's usually bitter or just generally unpleasant. And because that bitterness can be present in both, this is where understanding how they present and whether it's over or under extracted is going to be really helpful. So the bitterness, the sourness, whatever it is of under extracted coffee, the unpleasantness, it's going to hit kind of towards the front of your mouth and the sides of your mouth. So it might be like at the tip of your tongue as you take a sip of it, and we're talking about drinking in black, right? You take a sip of it, you kind of get it at the tip of your tongue or the sides of your tongue and your cheeks where it's unpleasant, it's papery, it feels like it's sucking the moisture out of your mouth. Right? It might be bitter, but you take a sip of it and you get that sensation. It often smells pretty good, but it could, you take a couple of sips back to back and it actually starts to seem to get better. That's usually a sign of under extracted coffee. If you add milk, if you dairy milk to under extracted coffee, it's actually going to make it worse. There's so many, like the non-dairy milks and creamers, there's so many bases and different manufacturing methods that there's no like across the board way to say if you add almond milk it's going to taste like this, but dairy is pretty reliable. Well extracted coffee is going to just come across the center of your tongue and just kind of hit all the points, and you might still not like it, so it might hit all the points and be unpleasant. But it's going to kind of hit all the points, and it's worth saying, right, people who prefer darker roasted coffees are always going to find lighter roasts to be too sour. And that's not an under extraction issue, that's a preference issue. Vice versa, people who prefer lighter roasted coffees are always going to find darker roasted coffees to be too bitter. That's not an over extraction issue, that's a preference issue. So if you know, okay, it's not really hitting the front, or like if it's not really hitting my tongue as I start to drink on it, it's not really hitting my tongue as I'm swallowing it. It tastes bitter, it kind of tastes bitter all over, I don't like it. That coffee is probably too dark for your taste preferences, right? Flip side, if it just tastes too sour all over, it's probably too light. You just have a different preference, which is fine. There's enough coffee for everybody. So what affects the end result, right? Your coffee to water ratio is going to affect how your coffee brews, right? We just saw that. The more coffee you have, the less water is able to extract from it overall. The less coffee you have, the more water extracts and keeps extracting until we get too much. And keep in mind, you can have coffee that's both over and under extracted, because mixing the two together doesn't fix the problem, because we've got all of those acids. So mixing over and under extracted coffee, we're just adding more acids, but also still keeping all of those unpleasant flavors of over extraction. Right? That's coffee to water ratio. Whether you measure it in grams or spoons is up to you. The grind, right, the size of your grind and how even it is gonna play a role. If your grind, the finer your grind is, the more surface area you have for water to penetrate deeper into it, as well as they're gonna interlock more. The coarser the grind is, the less surface area you have, the less water can extract from it. And bucket of rocks versus bucket of sand, right? Water is gonna pass through that bed much faster. If the grind of your coffee in your entire brewing method is relatively the same size, it all extracts at the same rate, you have a nice even extraction. if you have a lot of uneven particles where there's a lot of like larger chunks and smaller pieces, it's going to extract unevenly and you're going to have both over and under extracted coffee. So if you have a good grinder at home, absolutely grind your coffee at home. If you have one of those blade type situations, or you don't have a grinder, you're much better off getting the coffee ground for you at the store, right? The problem with the blades is that they're hitting the coffee and it's breaking up into chunks as opposed to being ground, where when it's ground between two burrs, only particles of a certain size can pass through. And so we have, not only do you have less control over how coarse or fine your grind is in a blade type grinder, but we also have a lot of like a wider bell curve of pieces. Temperature is going to affect how your coffee brews. The higher the temperature is, the faster it's going to brew, the more it's going to extract. The lower it is, the slower it's going to brew, the less it's going to extract. So the range for coffee temperature is 195 to 205 Fahrenheit. And that lower range, right, that 195, 196 is going to be better for darker roasted coffees. That higher range, 204, 205 is going to be better for lighter roasted coffees. Medium roasted coffees are going to be good right in the middle. And that's how, those darker roasted coffees, they're more porous, so it's easy to extract stuff. And we actually don't want to extract too much because we want to give it time to get all of those sugars without getting any of like the burnt sugars and those acids out, right? Lighter roasted coffees, we want to extract at a higher temperature so we get as much of those acids as we want to. So we get those like fruity flavors. If you don't have a thermometer, just make sure that you let your kettle rest on the stove so it's not boiling, because we're talking about the brewing temperature, right? Not the literal temperature of the water. So if you're going into any kind of like French press that's made out of glass, ceramic, metal, the material is going to absorb some of that heat. So make sure you let the water calm down on the stove before you pour it on your grinds, and kind of make adjustments from there, right? If you're getting too much extraction, let it cool a little bit more. If you're not getting enough extraction, right, this is one thing to try. In a coffee maker, if you want to get the water hotter, you can actually pour it into the chamber, brew a whole batch of it before you put the grinds in. This is going to heat up the water and heat up the whole system, then pour it back into that chamber and then brew your coffee as usual. The agitation as you're brewing is going to affect things in a good and bad way, right? So we want to make sure that we have enough agitation that the water penetrates into every, so coffee's not clumping together. Especially in a French press, we want to make sure we really shake it so it's not clumping together. The issue with too much agitation is if you're brewing in any kind of drip type method where the water needs to come through the coffee bed and you have a filter. The filter can clog from the coffee particles, or you can have, there's always going to be some discrepancy in particle size, so you can have the bigger chunks sink to the bottom and the smaller pieces float on top and just prevent the water from passing through altogether. So we want to make sure that we have enough agitation to hydrate all of those grinds, but not so much that we disturb the coffee bed. For the most part in the coffee maker, this is not something you need to worry about. I would be more worried about matching the coffee maker, or some coffee makers that have an arm that swings out to dispense the water as opposed to coming from the lid. They can just wet half of that coffee bed inside before it fills up enough to hydrate everything so you have really uneven extraction. If this is happening, if you could open the lid without stopping brewing, as the water starts to dispense, just give it a gentle stir to make sure all those grinds are getting hydrated. And the last is going to be time, right? The longer the water has in contact with those grinds, the more time it has to extract material. Applying everything we just learned, right? How do you brew coffee? If you're using a French press, probably the easiest method of brewing, right? This is basically just a jar with a sieve. You put your grinds in there, you let it sit. There's a general ideal time, if you're using the correct French press grind, which is in the 4-minute range, if you know that your coffee was ground for drip, stop the brew sooner, right? Maybe like 3.5 minutes. If somehow the coffee ended up too coarse or you want to get more extraction out of it, brew longer. And the beauty with a French press is that if your coffee is under extracted when you press it, then pour it in, let it sit for another 30 seconds. Taste it again. If it's already over extracted, you just know press it sooner next time. If your coffee is under extracted, you can try using less coffee the next time as well. Like I said, the ideal time is something in the 4-minute range, and that's kind of regardless of how much coffee you're brewing. In terms of agitation, you're really only concerned about making sure as soon as the water goes in, you want to give it a good swirl to make sure all of those grinds get hydrated. Any agitation that happens beyond that is irrelevant because all the coffee is in contact with all the water for the full duration of the brew. That's a French press. Drip methods can get a little bit trickier because you kind of have less control over what happens in an automatic coffee maker. In a manual coffee maker, you do have control over what happens, but you also need to have the skills to control that. So there's a larger learning curve. But essentially, right, in a manual coffee maker, you can use more or less coffee to adjust for over or under extraction, and you can increase the time by pouring the water slower or decrease the time by making sure that all of your water goes in sooner, right? So it has more time to drain. You don't want to pour too hard because it'll clog up the filter from too much agitation, but if you just like pour faster so it fills up higher, gravity will pull it through faster. In an automatic coffee maker, right? And so if your coffee is under extracted, you can use less coffee or you can grind finer. If your coffee is over extracted, you can use more coffee or grind a little bit coarser the next time. Automatic coffee makers get tricky because you have very little control of what happens once everything goes into the coffee maker. So you're kind of playing off of what you can do. So if your coffee is under extracted, try using less coffee, but pay attention to the time. Because we're making different volumes of coffee, because we can make different volumes of coffee, right? So something in 2 to 4 cups, right? We want it to be like 2.5, 3.5 minutes. If we're making a larger batch where it's like 6, 8 cups, that time makes sense for that time to take longer, for the water to have more contact time to extract more from that coffee bed. So if your coffee is under extracted and it's finishing, right? There's nothing dripping after like an amount of time that makes sense, right? But if you're making 2 cups of coffee and it takes like 2 minutes for all of the water to start dripping through, if you have a grinder, this is why grinders are like, if you're going to invest in anything, get yourself a good grinder. But if you can grind finer, grind finer. If you can't grind finer and your coffee is already ground, you can try adding more coffee because that's actually going to create a bigger coffee bed for the water to pass through. So how we just talked about, if your coffee is under extracted, you want to use less coffee. We're kind of doing the opposite here. And ultimately you might find that that's just too small of a coffee for your coffee maker to do a good job with. But you can also try maybe creating, if you can create agitation in the coffee bed, you can also try opening the lid up and giving it a gentle stir. You don't want to create a vortex that's going to drain the coffee out the bottom, but you can give it a gentle stir to actually end up clogging up that filter a little bit more to slow down the flow. And conversely, if your coffee is over extracted, you can try adding more coffee. But if it's taking too long, it just might be more coffee than your coffee maker can handle, because automatic coffee makers, they're not going to do a great job at the low end, and they're not going to do good job at the high end of what their capacity is. They're going to do a better job somewhere in the middle. And I think that's it. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that made brewing make more sense for you. And if you still have any questions, leave me a comment down below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.